In this lesson, we take a look at motion blur. We have this simple windmill with some basic animation. Let's go to frame around 100 and open up the render settings so we can have access to motion blur settings. Click on Arnold Render. Under the main tab, you have motion blur section. In order to see motion blur for your animated objects, the only thing you need to do is to check this enable option. And also you need to enable motion blur rendering in the IPR to see motion blur in real time. Now we start to get this subtle motion blur. Let's start with length. Length basically controls the amount of motion blur. So if you want longer motion blur trails, you need to increase this value. Let's try 1, 2, and 3. And as you can see, we have a longer motion blur trail. Also up here, we have this shutter angle indicator, which as you increase the length, you are also increasing the shutter angle. So if I change the length to 0.5, shutter angle is 180 degrees. Change it to 1, shutter angle is 360 degrees, and so on. Let's set the length back to 3. Now we have an issue. The circular motion of the blades is represented by these straight trails. And that is because the keys value is set to 2, which is a fairly low number for such a nonlinear motion. Keys is the number of substeps used for motion blur. Right now we only have 2 substeps and therefore we can't have any curved motion blur trail. Let's increase the keys to 5. And as you can see now, the motion blur trail represents the motion of the blades much better. We have this deformation option. So if you have a deformer like a bend deformer, for example, and you have animated it so the vertices are changing during time, you need to have deformation enabled. So motion blur would take that deformation into account. We have camera. If you have an animated camera in the scene and you want the motion of the camera to cause motion blur, you have to keep this option enabled. Otherwise, you can disable it. We have these position controls, which allows you to control when the camera shutter opens and closes relative to the frame being rendered. By default, it is set to center on frame, so the shutter is open during the current frame. So we are rendering frame 100 and the length of the motion blur is 3 frames. So from frame 98.5 to 101.5 will be calculated for motion blur calculations. Let's change the position to start on frame. When it is set to start on frame, the shutter opens at the current frame. So because the length is set to 3 and we're calculating from frame 100 to 103 this time. Remember, 100 is the current frame. Let's change the position to end on frame. Now the shutter closes at the current frame. The current frame is 100 and we are calculating from 97 to 100. If I change the position mode to custom, we can manually define the start and the end point of the motion blur. So for example, if I wanted to get the same results like when the position mode was set to start on frame, considering the length was 3 back then, I would change the start to 0 and end to 3 and we get the exact same result. If I set the start to -1.5 and end to 1.5, we would have the same result as when we had the position mode set to center on frame. And if I set the start to -3 and end to 0, the result would be like when we had the position set to end on frame. And you can manually choose any number you want. Let's set the position to center on frame. And if you close this windows and select the Arnold parameters tag that is applied to the camera, under the main tab, we have these shutter controls that can be used to make the motion blur range smaller. By default, the shutter size defined in the Arnold render settings are used, but this custom shutter size option allows you to set up a smaller shutter size within the global range. And we have shutter start and shutter end. The shutter range of the camera can be made smaller compared to the motion blur range exported from the scene by changing the shutter start and shutter end parameters. The value is frame relative, which means 0 stands for the frame start and 1 is for the frame end. Right now, the position mode is set to center on frame and the length is 3. If I enable custom shutter size and set the shutter start and end to -1 and 1, we get a shorter motion blur trail. So this way you can control your motion blur trails per camera. Let's disable custom shutter size for now. Down here you have shutter type, which is the type of filtering applied to time samples. We have box, which is the default filter. We have triangle. Compared to the box, as you can see, the trail is tailored in a triangular way. And finally, you can change it to curve and create your own filter. So let's add a few points here by control clicking. And now we get this custom motion blur trail. For now, let's use the box filter. Also, if you want to control motion blur per object, for example, if you don't want a certain object to, for example, not have motion blur, simply apply an Arnold parameters tag to that object, and under the motion blur tab, you can enable or disable motion blur per object. If you get back to the render settings, we have this instantaneous shutter for motion vectors, and this option can be useful when you want to export a motion vector AOV and add motion blur in post. If you disable motion blur completely and go to your AOVs and add a motion vector AOV, now if you check that AOV in the IPR, you notice it doesn't contain any data. That is because for this AOV to work, you need to have motion blur enabled first. So let's do that. Now the motion vector AOV contains the motion blur trails, which defeats the purpose of this AOV as we want just the raw vector data of our moving object. To get that, we can enable this instantaneous shutter for motion vectors, and now we get the right data. Let's get back to the beauty pass and turn off instantaneous motion blur, and let's set the length of the motion blur to maybe 0.5. And to clean up motion blur noise like depth of field, you need to increase the camera samples. So that is about motion blur in Arnold for Cinema 4D. See you in the next video.